the Quinn Marr Show.
All right, what's up, everyone? Before we get in the episode, I just wanted to give a big shout out to my guest, Michael Hirsh's book, Animation Nation. He talks about creating his company, Nelvana, where they help to produce classics like Franklin, Arthur, Babar, Little Bear, Maggie and the Ferocious Beast, Magic School Bus. I could go on and on. So if you love animation, you got to get this book. You can get it Indigo, you can get it on Amazon, and you can also get the Kindle version. Trust me, it is a must read. All right, let's get into the conversation with the legendary Michael Hirsh. My next guest is basically the reason your childhood had a theme song. He's a co-founder of Nelvana. He's behind some of the greats like the Magic School Bus, Beyblade, Max and Ruby, Franklin, Little Bear, and even Star Wars, Droids, and Ewoks. If you watch cartoons in the 80s, 90s, or early 2000s, this man probably raised you more than your babysitter did. He's a pioneer in animation, a champion of Canadian storytelling, and somehow turned a group of pastel-colored bears into pop culture icons. It is my pleasure to welcome to the Quinn Marr Show, Michael Hirsh. Michael, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure, Quinn. Glad to be here.
I like to always go back to the beginning of just everybody's lives. And you have a pretty fascinating upbringing. You're born in Belgium. You and your family emigrated to Toronto when you were 3. And then both your parents were Holocaust survivors, which is crazy. Your mother was hidden by nuns and your father was liberated during a death march from a concentration camp.
Yes, my father had been in Auschwitz.
Wow.
Yeah.
Geez. So for you then, like, just because like you didn't have the most normal childhood, like in that aspect of like your parents' history, what was your house like growing up and your family?
So in terms of growing up as a child of Holocaust survivors, I was fortunate. My father talked about his experiences quite frequently. So I grew up understanding that my parents had been through all this horrible experience during the war, that they had all this stress. So those are quirks they might have had. And I was just, soaking it in, listening to their stories and learning what I could.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did read that, I think it was 2015, you went and visited Auschwitz yourself.
Yeah, it was the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and it was done as a big event. And I went and, it was a very emotional trip, as you might expect. And, it's something that I think, people will generally benefit from because it's really a warning of the worst that humanity did.
Right. Were there years leading up to that where you had thought about going, but then you just never did up until the anniversary?
Yeah, my father, I talked to him about it while he was alive, and he never recommended it. He basically, wasn't going to do it himself and didn't recommend that myself or my sisters should follow through. He felt strongly about that. So I did. At the time of the 70th anniversary, my father was deceased, my mother was deceased, and so I went because I thought it was the right thing to do.
That's really interesting. One thing I'd like to do is rewind back to my guest's childhood. So when you were a kid, what kind of things were you obsessed with?
So I was obsessed with reading books. So I was a very early reader. I enjoyed books, and that really had a big at Nelvana. I found a lot of books for us to animate. So everything from Babar, which librarians had read to me as a kid in the public library, to projects like Marie Sendak's Little Bear, Max and Ruby from Rosemary Wells, Bill Joyce's Rolie Polie Olie. So, we did Hardy Boys, we did Never Ending Story, Pippi Longstocking, really a good long run of books that were great books.
That's awesome. And then I read that you moved to New York when you were, I think it was 13, and then you attended the Bronx High School of Science. So where did the interest in science come from for you?
I was a good student and I was interested in math and science. And this was a school that was, well, it was a 45-minute trip from my home. We had moved to the Bronx, and it was a really good school, and was a great experience in terms of making good friends and learning a lot in those high school years.
Now, you mentioned about learning and everything, but you did skip school to go watch some underground cinema. So what kind of films were you drawn to, and then how did those inspire you creatively at the time?
Yeah, so at the time, my good friend Ilya said to me, they're showing some American Underground films at Hunter College's campus, which was just a 10-minute walk from Prague Science. He said, let's cut classes and go. And I'd never cut classes before. So I said, oh, okay. That new experience.
Yeah.
And so we went to see the films, and there were films by Kenneth Anger, Stan Brakhage. It was a really good mix of different film artists at the time, and it really caught my attention. And it led to me wanting to make films, putting teams of people together with my friends who would help crew them and act in them. And we started making films, together. And I continued doing that through college and made experimental films through my early years.
So then before you did this whole skipping school and watching the movies and be like, oh, wow, this is what I want, like something I could do. What did you want to do when you grew up? Did it have to do with something with math or science?
At that point, I hadn't really focused on it. I was interested in literature. I was interested in philosophy. I was interested in theater. I was interested in a lot of things. So I was just sort of soaking it all in. And what I really liked about the films was that, it was exciting. It was a medium that, I had grown up watching Hollywood movies, but here were movies that you could make yourself with your friends and get together with friends and show them to each other, show the films to each other. And it was, you were part of this new buoyant community of filmmakers.
Right. You mentioned about going to college, and then obviously that's where you met Jack Christie and Patrick Lubert. Now, for those who don't know, who are they, and like what was this creative partnership like then, and what it's turned into now?
So Jack Christie, I met in my freshman year at Glendon College in Toronto, and we got along very well, right off the top. And we decided we'd make a film together. So we started writing a film that we called Assassination Generation. And then we raised a little money so we could do a kind of a test study, a pilot project. And so we shot about 10 minutes of it that summer. And that movie evolved into a sort of frolicking satire called Voulez-vous coucher avec God, which had a broader perspective of making fun of everything.
Did you not ever want to be like in front of the camera? It was always behind the camera for you?
Yeah, I never particularly wanted to be. I was in front of the camera on some of these experimental films,
right?
But that wasn't where I wanted. I really wanted to be, making the film.
Okay. And that's fair. I mean, you need the people behind the camera and stuff, right? So obviously we were talking about your first credited project, and I read that it says you spent 6 years developing it. What was it that made that process so long? Because obviously that's not normal.
Which project?
I'm not gonna be able to. The one we just talked about. I'm not gonna be able to pronounce it. Yes.
Okay. So yeah, that's because we did it a little bit each year. So we'd raise some money from friends and family, and we could go shoot, 10, 20 minutes. And we managed to keep a lot of the cast together for that period of time. And our star of our movie was an underground celebrity named Tuli Kupferberg, who was a beatnik poet. He was the poet in Howl who jumps off the Brooklyn Bridge and lives. And that's a true story. He did. But Tuli was the lead of a group called the Fugs, a group that did outrageous songs and were kind of revolutionary and radical for their time. And so he played God in the movie.
Got you. Okay. And now I don't know if there's anything in between, but after that, I read that you started making the animated shorts for Sesame Street. Were there things in between these projects?
There were other shorts, but once I was working on Voulez-vous, that was kind of what I was working on. So it was like a long, ongoing project that just was all-encompassing. So, but you'd have to raise money for it, find some work, make a little money, and spend it on the movie. But the shorts came about because I had a friend who was a draft dodger at that time, because a lot of young Americans who were looking to not participate in the Vietnam War thought, well, we'll come to Canada. And Canada took them in. And so my friend had worked for Jim Henson previously in New York. And he had a commission from Henson for the first year of Sesame Street to do 5 letters of the alphabet. And Henson was going everywhere looking for people to do these, tiny bits and pieces that he needed. And he needed a lot of them. So my friend, who was busy and working, night and day on a job, asked me if I could put together a crew, which I did. And he trained us in how to do plasticine animation. And that's how we did those 5 shorts. And when it was finished, we all had a good time with it. And we asked him, would he like to continue? And he said, no, he was happy with the work he was doing. He had just done this as a favor for Henson. So we then became a group called Laugh Arts, where we decided to get our own projects. And that eventually led to the formation of Nelvana by myself, Patrick Bluebear, and Clive Smith.
Now, I read that you were still learning the animation as you were doing this. Now, that seems crazy to me, because I don't think that obviously can happen nowadays. But that is really cool. The fact that you guys were working on this, you're learning as you're going, and then something as big as Sesame Street. I know it was new at the time, but that's just, when I read that little tidbit, that was that's pretty incredible.
Well, but that's kind of how a lot of people learn, right?
True.
You get on a job, somebody leaves, you have to step up, and you either step up and succeed or you're out, right?
That's a good point. Yeah, you're getting thrown in the deep end, right?
And that happens a lot. So that it's not as unusual as you think.
Even now?
Yeah, I think even now. The reality is that, people can move up pretty aggressively depending upon, what it is they're working on, et cetera. But, by that point, I'd been making films for, I'm trying to think of how many years, but say, 9 years, 8 or 9 years. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of learned a lot, right?
True.
And so, I understood the nuts and bolts of filmmaking, even though this was animation and wasn't live action.
Was this where you decided you wanted to really dive headfirst into the animation?
Yeah. So the way we got there was, at the time, there was no film industry. We were in Toronto, Canada, and there was no film industry here, and there was no animation industry here. And it was really, there were a few TV shows that were made for local purposes. Every so often, somebody came from the States. And actually, Henson did quite a few specials here, but they would just use it as a facility, right? So, people who wanted to be in the industry had to leave and go to New York or LA. And we decided we didn't want to do that. We would actually start this company here. And because there were the broadcasters didn't have animation studios in their own networks, we decided that we would have services that we could sell and that people would buy. And that turned out to be true. People would buy services like doing titles for shows, logos, titles for the ends of, and sometimes if they needed animation clips for illustrated point, we'd get those commissions. So we were kind of living on the edges of the industry, but it was allowing us to build our skill set and our business.
That's really cool. And then we obviously talked about you guys co-founding Nelvana in 1971. I know you're talking about the animation landscape then, but it was basically, there wasn't really a ton, like you were just saying. What was your original vision for Nelvana at the time, and how did that evolve over the years?
So we thought of ourselves as a filmmaking collective or cooperative. We didn't, even though we were a company, we didn't have a real corporate vision, right? It was more about, making interesting projects. We were still experimental filmmakers at the beginning, and we always kept that in our DNA. So even when we did commercial projects like Beetlejuice, we would bring in, very early CGI on an experimental basis to sort of capture the mixed media flavor that Tim Burton had established in the movie.
Right.
So, we were always, sort of pushing the envelope of projects that we could do and trying to advance the craft. And so our vision early on, as we got more and more into animation, was we wanted to sort of enter the US market and the global market. And we decided that our best entry point, since there was no industry in Canada and nobody was looking to hire Canadians to do this stuff, was to try to deliver more quality than, people were doing. And at the time, studios like Hanna-Barbera and Filmation were dominating the animation business. And while they both had done good work, by this point, they were kind of phoning it in. So they were down to doing maybe what might be 6,000 cells in a half hour or 8,000. And so we started out by doing 20,000, 22,000. And the number of animation cells basically meant there was more animation work in the show, more effort that had gone into it, and it showed on the screen. It looked more like what you saw in movie theaters than it did what was on TV at the time. So that was our focus, and that became our vision, was to become, the highest quality deliverer of animation.
When you guys started growing and getting so big at the time, did like Hanna-Barbera, did you ever hear from those guys or like other competitors about like you guys climbing up the ranks and getting to the same level as them?
Yeah, I think when we had done A Cosmic Christmas and we were up for, George Lucas had seen that and he decided he wanted us to do the first Star Wars cartoon, which was a 10-minute short called The Faithful Wookiee, which was part of a 2-hour holiday special. And Hanna-Barbera had wanted that production and had lost it to us. And so Bill Hanna actually called up and said he wanted to visit the studio, and he came and he visited us. And he was very funny. He showed up like an hour or two before anybody else. And, because there were always people working in the studio, he walked in and he started leaving notes on work because, Hanna and Barbera, Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera had actually done fantastic work in their early days, right? They did Tom and Jerry. They really understood the craft and the art. And, so that was interesting. And we had a few other visitors at the time, who all kind of expressed an interest in buying us, but we weren't for sale at that point.
That's pretty nice of you guys to let them just come in and kind of see what you guys are doing. Cause they're your competitors. I'm surprised you just said, yeah, sure. No problem. Come on in.
Well, there's always been that kind of camaraderie among studios. It's a small sort of industry, and that was our attitude anyway.
Right. But there was no bad blood, eh?
No,
that's good though.
Well, not from our point of view. And it wouldn't have been,
exactly.
they wouldn't have made money doing this 10-minute cartoon. It wasn't like they had lost their business because of us. Right. They managed to keep a good business going for a long time.
You mentioned about the whole Cosmic Christmas and then George Lucas contacting you guys. So how did he end up seeing the movie?
Well, it was a half-hour special. He must have watched it, or a friend told him about it, But when he saw it, and he was looking for an animation company to do the 10-minute cartoon for this holiday special, he had his people track us down, and we got the call, and I flew out to the Bay Area and drove out to Marin County and met with George.
How different was it? I know you guys were obviously working with other people at the time too, but how different was it working on someone else's project, especially something as big as Star Wars? Did you guys have any clue it was going to be as massive as it ended up being?
The answer is yeah, because by that time, the first Star Wars movie had happened, right? Mm-hmm. So you knew this was the biggest thing ever.
Yeah.
Right. And they were working on the sequel. So, yes, we knew that this was a fantastic opportunity. And at the time, we were working on our second fully animated special called The Devil and Daniel Mouse. And we had to ask ourselves, could we do both? Because we were not a studio that had ever done two projects at one time. We always did one at a time. So it was a big change. And we decided we couldn't not do it, and we couldn't not do the special we were on. So we figured out how to do both.
That's awesome.
And that clearly was the right answer.
I like the difference between with droids and Ewoks because they are just so different. Droids obviously had a more whimsical tone. How did you approach telling the stories in the Star Wars universe, but trying to make it your own at the same time?
No, so it was clear this was George's project, right? He had brought us in to do both, and so we were looking to, realize his vision for Ewoks and his vision for droids. And with droids, when he presented us with the property, he told us, and you're going to have R2D2 and C3PO, the Laurel and Hardy of the Star Wars galaxy, as your leads. And we said, well, what about Luke and Leia and Han and Darth Vader? He said, no, you won't have those. You'll just have the droids. Yeah. So we made do with what we had. And we were, again, the focus was totally the vision that George had and how we were going to execute against that. And we did. So, and I think the shows stand up well today, even though it's 40 years ago.
100%. Looking back, how do you think the droids and the Ewoks helped expand the Star Wars universe before the prequels or the spin-offs?
It's a good question. Clearly, again, George had been mapping out the universe. So he gave us those pieces of the Star Wars universe that we were, utilizing. So again, there was a master plan, and we were following that master plan in this case.
That makes sense. I mentioned this in the intro, but the Care Bears movie was a massive hit. What was it like taking a toy brand to the big screen before that became like an industry norm? Because that wasn't really a thing before, right?
Yeah, no, that was the first time that one of these toys had become a movie, as far as I can think of. Movies had become toys, but toys hadn't become movies. And the key to the Care Bears was there was a lot of depth in the property. So the the Care Bears had a lot of personality. Each character was carefully delineated, and they were well designed as a team, and came together to have these adventures. And one of the things that we injected was a lot of the comedy, because clearly without the humor, you weren't going to get people, watching these, quote unquote toys coming to life on the screen. So we had a lot of fun making the movie, and we got some great music from Carole King, who wrote the title song for the movie, and John Sebastian, who wrote some songs as well. And all in all, it was a joy when it turned out to be a hit. That was great. And that was our second animated movie, because we had made one for ourselves called Rock and Roll, which had original music from Debbie Harry and Iggy Pop and Lou Reed and Cheap Trick and Earth, Wind & Fire. And that movie did not work from a commercial point of view. But
it was expensive, right?
Yeah, it became it grew.
It has a cult following.
Pardon me? It's got a cult following, yes.
Yeah. But so then you did Rock and Roll first, and then it was Care Bears?
Yes. So we, and Rock and Roll cost us probably about $8 million at the time, which was a fair amount of money.
Yeah.
And Care Bears, though, cost like $2.5 million. Care Bears was a huge hit, and Rock and Roll wasn't. So it wasn't always the money that you put into something.
Were you kind of nervous taking on Care Bears after not having the success you wanted from Rock and Roll?
No, we thought that Care Bears had a better chance of working because they were so hot as a toy. Like Care Bears were the biggest toy in the universe at the time, next to for preschoolers, because Star Wars wasn't for preschoolers.
Yeah.
So it was a great property, and it had supportive owners who were Kenner Toys and American Greetings.
When after the success of Care Bears, were there a lot of people coming to you with more ideas to turn toys into movies, like just other kinds of toys that you had to say no?
We had a few of those, but never that many. It's interesting. Really? Yeah, one of the things that's been a surprise that I've had in my career is, look, we did Lucas's first cartoons. We worked with Steven Spielberg on his first Saturday morning show, which was a version of American Tail. We worked with Tim Burton on the Beetlejuice adaptation. And I expected that more people would come knocking on our doors with opportunities, but we always had to be the ones who were going and pursuing opportunities. And
that's weird. I'm surprised.
That's just how the business worked. And from talking to other friends, that's kind of what they've experienced.
Yeah.
You kind of think, like, if you become the best heart surgeon in a city, people will be calling you because you're the top heart surgeon, right?
So just going to go down a list of some of your most iconic children's TV projects. So Clifford the Big Red Dog, what drew you to adapting Clifford, and like how did you expand such a concept into a simple concept into a rich world, because it was pretty basic in the books versus what you guys brought onto the screen.
No, the version that we did of Clifford stayed pretty basic. So it was the home video version. So before Clifford had a TV show, we did not do the TV show. We did the home videos. We did, I can't remember if it was 5 or 7 or 8 home videos. But I think that, enriching the Clifford life was not part of our story. Sad to say.
So then where did it go then from when you guys having it to what it turned into in the, I think would have been early 2000s?
Yeah, at that point, Scholastic produced their own animated show, and I think they used their own studio.
That makes sense. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about a show that I used to watch on YTV that I remember being so scared of, and that was Tales from the Crypt Keeper. Recently, I only just found out that there was Tales from the Crypt, which is the live action version. So Tales from the Crypt is such a departure from like your children's work, and just a lot more darker. So what was that like working on something more adult?
So it kind of fit in with who we were, though, because it fit in with our background. So the comic books, the Tales from the Crypt and Tales from the Crypt Keeper, are late 40s, early 50s. They were so kind of out there and outrageous that they had a backlash, and the backlash was the creation of what was called the comic book code. And if you wanted to sell your comic books to children, they had to pass the comic book code. And the EC Comics, who did Tales from the Crypt comics, would not easily have done that. So they had to scale back. But in the early comics, they were pretty out there. Those are basically morality tales, like the medieval morality plays. And they're always about, people being seduced by something easy, by, an opportunity that has them doing something bad and being punished for it. So it's a clear, historically sort of accepted type of storytelling for kids. And I had grown up with these comics as a kid and, actually liked them a lot. So a lot of what I've done is going back and finding things that I enjoyed as a kid and, getting the rights to them and making shows out of that.
My nephew's has been bugging either whenever he's with me or my sister or whoever that he wants to start watching. He's only 6. He wants to start watching horror things. So I was actually talking to my fiance yesterday that I think like as he gets a little bit older, I would say maybe a couple more years, something like Tales from the Crypt Keeper is something that would be good for him, because it's not like obviously crazy horror, but it's more kid friendly. And it was cool that you guys were able to turn that into a kid friendly, because like I said, I was watching that when I was like I think 10 or something, and it was even still pretty creepy then.
And you learned a valuable morality lesson, right? Like, don't steal, don't snitch, don't do this, don't do that. So it's just one of the oldest forms of storytelling for kids are those sort of morality tales.
We were talking about just books in general. Little Bear, Franklin, Berenstain Bears, Max and Ruby. You brought so many gentle book-based stories to life. What do you think the secret was of adapting these kind of quiet, character-driven tales for TV?
So one of the things that we decided as a studio early on was when we started to adapt books, that if we were going to take a property, whether it was Star Wars, which is not a book but a movie, or we were going to do Babar or Tintin, based upon the French comic books, we would be true to the property. When it came to doing our own properties, we could be original and, imaginative and fantastical. But when we did other people's properties, what was the use of optioning something that was popular if you're going to totally change it? So we basically were always true to the underlying values of the property and the underlying personality of it.
That's awesome. I love I was talking to my fiance about this the other day that when we have kids, we definitely want to show them things like Little Bear or Franklin, just because again, it's just like quiet, like it's just calming shows that I feel like is missing compared to a lot of stuff now, kid show wise, that I at least that I see my niece or nephew watching. I feel like it's just more like stimulating at that point. Yeah.
So we were basically doing things that were really true to those books, right? They're gentle, they're charming, they're warm, and we wanted to capture that. And At the same time, because we were also doing Saturday morning, we understood that not everything was a Saturday morning cartoon and that you had to have other things for kids. And this was at the same time that pay TV and cable specialty channels were growing and they could afford to commission programming. So the first project we did that was in that category was Babar.
Mhm.
And I coined a term to describe the Babar episodes as charmth, charm and warmth. And they were basically, again, usually reasonably slow paced. They were family friendly, kid friendly. And, we continued that on as we did these projects that were not necessarily Saturday morning projects, but were basically going to be on cable or on pay TV or home video.
True. You're mentioning about Bar. I feel like it touched on some heavy themes as well, like loss in leadership too. How did you approach those like a little bit more mature elements for a young audience?
Well, so those mature elements were in the books.
Mhm.
And so we really just followed how the book dealt with it, so with any loss, it was done respectfully, acknowledging it. In terms of leadership, it was all about the lessons, that leaders have to learn. And Babar, who was a young leader, shared with his children things that happened to him that they could learn from. And so that was a theme that, in a way, not that dissimilar from the way Tales from the Crypt Keeper works, except it wasn't horror, etc. But it's all about parents sharing with children stories that will help them grow morally.
Right. We were talking about just like more gentle shows and warmth and everything. Then you go on the flip side, you look at something like Magic School Bus, which is just chaotic. Did you realize at the time just how like culturally important the Magic School Bus would become?
Yes, because again, we talked about earlier my experience of going to Bronx High School of Science, where science was an emphasis. And so the chance to sort of give back and share a passion for, science as a young kid, even though it's a lower age group, was there for me. And so I helped Scholastic push that show into existence, because it's interesting. It was not, PBS didn't fund it. Scholastic funded it. Scholastic and Nelvana funded it. We basically pre-bought the international rights and helped to fund the show.
And
But
that's not normal. Like normally something like that like would be funded by PBS, let's say, if that's who you're
and
working
for
with.
whatever reason, they didn't. So it's always interesting what works and what doesn't work for the broadcasters, right?
Right. One of my favorite shows growing up was Rolie Polie Olie, and I listened to an interview with you just talking about like the animation, it being so ahead of its time. What breakthroughs or like challenges came with that format for you guys?
So with Rolie Polie Olie, it wasn't our first CGI show. We had done a show called Donkey Kong Country based upon the Nintendo game with Media Lab, which was a French company at the time, and they were early players in CGI. And we built up some CGI expertise with them, and then we did Rolie Polie Olie. And what made Rolie Polie Olie, I think, such a successful CGI show in that year, which was 97 or 98, I think, was that the show was perfectly designed to be done with the software of the times. Like, we weren't trying to do, realistic looking people, because that wasn't working that well. There had been a show called Reboot, that was modestly successful but didn't break out. But Rolie Polie Olie lent itself to what the software could really do. When we got it, it was just a poem on his wall. But we turned it into a TV series, and he's a great property creator.
That's awesome. We're talking about just this is kind of on the same lines of Care Bears, is merchandising and then the show. Now, Beyblades, you're balancing storytelling with a massive merchandising push. How did you approach that balance now coming off of the Care Bears, however many years before?
Yeah, so we had been around toy-related projects for a long time, and we were also we had been bringing in some properties from Japan. So we'd brought in Cardcaptor Katsura. We had brought in another one, name escapes me at the moment, and Beyblade, I think, was our third, and it was the most successful of the group. But it had a great play pattern, And we were just at that point at the height of our game and well positioned to make the show a hit outside of Japan.
There was two things I always remember that me and like all my friends would do at recess: either play marbles or Beyblades. And everyone would, like, some guys would bring like their own little stadiums with them. Like, just on the schoolyard, that was massive for me. It was huge. I didn't actually know how massive the show itself was at the time versus the toys, because the toys were huge.
Yeah, and the show was very supportive of the toy, and showed kids how to play and play with each other. So it was a perfect storm.
Exactly. Arthur, again, another one of my favorites that's ran forever. What do you think gave Arthur such staying power of being able to do what it's done?
So I think it was a combination of PBS and the broadcasters who ran it around the world being the right broadcasters, so that it was in the right home to sustain it. Secondly, the property was very successful as a series of books, and it was aimed at that 4 to 8 year old which can be an elusive audience. And you had well written books, and the broadcasters and the creative people on the show stuck to what made the book successful, what made Arthur appealing. So generally, when you see one of these properties that comes from books successful, it's because the books themselves had solved the mystery of how to have a hit property, and the filmmakers understood it and delivered it.
Were there other shows that you brought from books that just didn't do well at all? I'm sure there might have been a couple that you were surprised that didn't do that great.
Yeah. So, for example, Pippi Longstocking, it did better in some countries where Pippi was bigger, but I thought it would be bigger in North America, and it was just okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Neverending Story was the same way. So there were, we did Corduroy Bear, which is a great children's book, but it only had one season. Sometimes they just didn't catch on. We had one that we really liked called George and Martha that was on YTV in Canada and HBO in the US. Nathan Lane and Andrea Martin were the voices. Great production, looked beautiful, told good stories, great characters, but it didn't break out.
Right.
So it just happens. It's really not everything breaks out, and not everything captures the moment.
Oh, that's fair. The last show I just wanted to ask you about was Caillou. I feel like it has its lovers and haters. What were your intentions with the show's tone and portrayal of basically real life toddler behavior?
Yeah, so again, it was to continue what had been started already, with the books, and deliver on how the books, delivered stories about a young kid. And it was very popular from the beginning on PBS. It worked really, really well. And so it was a hit show. And when you've got a hit show, you just keep making it.
100%. Now, more on the business sides of things. So, selling Nelvana to Chorus. So, it was your baby. You co-founded, built it, turned it into this like animation powerhouse. What led to the decision to sell to Chorus?
So by that time, we were 30 years old as a company. We had gone from back in the day, even as late as, say, the early 80s, never making more than a half hour in a year of production. By the time we were ready to sell, we were making 20 series. We were the dominant independent. And in order to continue to grow, and in order to be able to sustain that kind of production level, we felt it would be important to be vertically integrated with a broadcaster. And in Canada, the largest kids broadcaster was Chorus. So it kept us Canadian, and at the same time gave us this large group of channels that needed content. Unfortunately, the combination did not work out the way we had hoped. But, there was a lot of hope that was there with the building of the two companies, or the merging of the companies.
Was that a tough goodbye for you?
It was very tough because it was 30 years of, sweat, blood, and tears,
Yeah. Looking back now, I know you just kind of mentioned it quickly there. Do you think that deal helped take Nelvana to like the next level, or do you ever think like what might have happened if you kept it independent?
So it didn't take us to the next level. I'm not sure that I've sort of focused on what might have happened if we didn't do it. Like, it was the right thing to do at the time for where the company was, and it just didn't work for a lot of reasons, right?
Right.
One of the reasons was the fact that Chorus was owned by the Shaw family, who ran one of the two largest cable companies in the country and a satellite company. So that when, you know, about sold the company, YouTube was really beginning to grow. Um, they basically did nothing to sort of move into streaming or be there in the next generation of distribution, because they were owned by a company that was heavily invested in cable and pay. So they were kind of in their lane, and Nelvana did not benefit from the growth of streaming the way that my other companies did that
Hmm.
weren't connected to a cable company.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. I know down the line you end up getting more involved with streaming. Now this next chapter is kind of wild. So you win an auction for Sonar, which at the time had been through a lot, and then you rebrand it into Cookie Jar. What made you see the opportunity there instead of just a risk?
So the opportunity was there because Cinar was Nelvana's nearest competitor, was doing shows like us. In fact, that's how I got into Arthur and Conan, through Cinar, the acquisition of Cinar. So I understood the library, I understood the brands they had, and they had 20% of Teletoon, just like Nelvana did. So we basically had an output deal with Teletoon, and I thought we can make use of that, and that the company had been in difficult times for about 5 years. And so the fact it would give us a place to rebuild from. And so we were successful at rebuilding, Cinar into Cookie Jar. And I like to say that I took the sin out of Cinar.
That's good. I like that. How would you describe the difference between what you built with Cookie Jar versus Nelvana? I know, of course, like the time in the world was different, but did it feel like a second act, or was it just like a completely new story to you?
No, it did feel like a second act, but the next act was the beginning of streaming, right? So YouTube had come in 04. By the time we ended up combining Cookie Jar with DHX, Cookie Jar was the leading supplier to streamers. So Netflix was buying most of the outside of YouTube, and we were figuring out how to work with YouTube. So it gave us a chance to be early players in streaming.
Now you mentioned just about selling. So you've now built and sold two major companies. When you sold Cookie Jar to DHX in 2012, what made you feel like it was the time?
Well, so we had completed an acquisition during the '08 meltdown, and we had bought another big library called Deke. And because there was the economic meltdown just after we did the acquisition, it put our company into difficult times with our banks because we had borrowed to do the Deke acquisition. So we had to work our way out of trouble, which we did, but it took a couple of years. But our focus was all about how many shows can we sell to the streamers. And so we built that business. And that was the focus.
Now it's insane to look back at like something like with streaming wise, like Netflix, where like you were literally renting the DVDs and sending them back, like mailing them. But you obviously, you and your team seem like you guys were ahead of it the whole time. You when you saw the streaming like Netflix or YouTube or whatever, you were there. What do you look at YouTube now for like kids programs?
So YouTube has become the place where you can start something on YouTube and build it up. You can't really do that in traditional broadcasting because you just don't get the time to experiment and to sort of build an audience, right? You either come out and you're successful or you're off the air, or when maybe you're not off the air, but they're not ordering more shows. So that's kind of the end of the business. So what I liked about it was the fact that, like making experimental films, you can do something with yourself and your friends. So if you're a young person listening to us, this is the best place to build content, to try something out, and you don't have to spend a lot of money making it. There's enough animation tools that are available on the net that you can make shows on your own and build an audience if something resonates with that audience, right? And then if something becomes very successful, like Bee and Puppy Cat or Has Been Hotel or the Great Digital Circus Show out of Australia, you can basically sell Netflix or Amazon or one of the other streamers on commissioning a show.
Mm-hmm. Now sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so YouTube is really the best sort of place for people to begin their careers.
I know I asked you earlier if you ever sit back and like think about like what ifs. Have you ever thought like if you had YouTube back when you were starting out just in your career?
The answer is I haven't thought of it quite that way because you can't go back in time. I'm sorry, Quinn, but it just ain't happening.
I know.
But I do think that I related to YouTube in part because I saw young people putting stuff on. A 14-year-old, a 15-year-old could make their production. They'd make another one. They'd make another one. And eventually they got better and better at what they did. And some of them made little businesses out of it. They could hire their friends to work on their productions, right? And they could make enough money to, buy their parents a house, right?
Mm-hmm.
So lots of things possible. They have lots of opportunities if they become successful on YouTube, either to stay on YouTube or potentially to work with the big players like Netflix or Amazon or Apple to do a show.
Yep, absolutely. So with DHX, after the deal, you stayed on for a bit, but then you stepped away. What led the decision to leave? Was it creative, strategic, or were you just kind of like itching to build something new again?
Yeah, so it was all about seeing the next phase in my mind as to what would work. And also people were coming to me. So Fred Seibert was a friend who had built Frederator, and they had done Adventure Time, and we had done Fairly Odd Parents co-produced together in the early days. And Mainframe, the Vancouver studio that had been busy doing Reboot and Barbie, they basically were in trouble. And Fred's company was in trouble, Frederator. So I thought, well, if I put these two companies together, one is kind of a legacy production business, and the other one, has its feet deeply into streaming, right? Because Frederator was the first MCN, and at Frederator we managed, thousands of creators on YouTube. So we had an insight into how to work with YouTube and how to build a business on YouTube. So that was all good learning and took me into the next wave of where the world was going.
Yeah, then you go and obviously you launch another company, which is Wow Unlimited Media. I've figured out you're basically like the Marvel Cinematic Universe of Canadian kids TV, just because like how you build up one thing, you go, okay, here you go, you sell it to someone, you do it again. So the big idea behind Wow, how different was it between or from Nelvana or Cookie Jar in terms of your approach and your goals? I know also you mentioned the streaming, but kind of in that aspect, what was so different?
Yeah, so in the case of Nelvana, we were really fully enmeshed as a production company. We were a great distribution company, we were a terrific merchandising company, but our roots were in production. By the time I was building Cookie Jar, eventually the game was changing, and it was all about beginning to understand how to work with streamers, the business that was building. And so I wanted to focus on that. So in a sense, one of the benefits of selling these companies at a certain stage is that you're not tied up in its past. You can focus on where you think the business is going rather than where it's been. Because often you're focused on where you have your biggest success at the time. And it's hard to take your eye off that ball and focus on where the business is going.
Has that been difficult for you at all, just to like see something so big, wipe your hands clean of it and walk away? Like, do you ever feel like there were times where you were stuck on that, saying like, okay, I need to do something just as big as Care Bears or just as big as Beyblade, like, or did you kind of do the whole wipe your hands clean and move on?
Yeah, it was more wipe your hands clean and move on.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it was hard to, once you sell a company, that you've kind of sold it, right?
Yeah, true. Yeah, literally. Yeah, no, it's fair. Yeah. And now
And
we've got
and you don't want to live in the past.
well, that too. That makes sense. Now we got Floating Island Entertainment, where you're still the CEO and executive producer. So what's the vision this time around?
No, so this Floating Island is my own production company for my own little projects. So we're not building Floating Island into something.
Got you.
So,
Okay.
at this point, I'm focused on, I wrote my memoirs, Animation Nation. I'll just share the book cover with people.
Yep. That's awesome.
Go. And they can get it through, indigo.com or amazon.com. But essentially, I've been sharing a lot of my story with, with fans and interested parties, and doing a lot of podcasts like yours, Quinn, and happy to sort of provide any sort of thoughts about where I think the future is going, and try to be helpful to young people entering the field. So I'm doing a presentation at something called the Congress for Humanities at George Brown College next Sunday. As part of that, I'm going to be doing the keynote speech at Annecy, the big animation festival in France, in 2 weeks. And so I'm staying active, sharing what I know with the next generation.
That's amazing. So my final question, and I ask this to every single guest, is what's one thing you miss most about being a kid?
I don't know that I miss anything about being a kid. I enjoyed being a kid, but I couldn't wait to grow up. So, I was always wanting to be independent and wanting to be doing my own things, and, having aspirations that were beyond what was my then current age group, right? So I really wanted to grow up, and so I'm not sure that any part of me wants to be that kid again, because kids are sort of hankering to do things, hankering to be adults, right? Well, I'm an adult, so
that you were the first person to answer it like that. That's a great answer. I really do like that. That's awesome. Well, Michael, honestly, thank you so much for sharing your story and quite literally shaping someone like my childhood. Your work has definitely left a massive mark on generations for kids, me, before me, after me. So no, it's been a real honor. I really do appreciate you coming on here to talk to me today.
Okay, great. Glad to talk to you, Quinn.
And that was the Quinn Marr Show.